Story 1. I was desperate for a job, so when I saw an ad that said night shift, $25 an hour, must be comfortable with silence, I thought it sounded perfect. It had been over a year since I last worked, and the pay was good. The company was called Laurel Corp. They didn't have a website or much information online, but they had a local address and a phone number. It seemed like an older company, and I liked that. A few days later, I got an interview. The man who interviewed me was named Mr. Reed. He wore an old, heavy wool suit that looked very hot. He asked me if I could work late, if I was okay with the dark, and if I was comfortable with silence. I asked, "Do you mean like no talking?" He said, "No talking, no sound," in a flat voice. He added that I would get a handbook after I was hired. That should have been my first clue that something was off, but I really needed the job. I started the following week. When I arrived, there were no lights on in the building, just a flickering sign that said Laurel Corp. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years. Mr. Reed handed me a thick booklet when I walked in. "Read this. You start in 15 minutes, he said without looking at me. The handbook had many rules and policies, most of them straightforward, but there were a few strange ones. No talking after 10 p.m. Keep the lights off unless told to turn them on. Do not leave the premises during your shift. If the elevator goes to the basement, stay on your floor. If you hear knocking, do not answer the door." The rest of the rules were normal, like policies on brakes and safety hazards. The rule about knocking was odd, but I needed the paycheck. Mr. Reed gave me a key and showed me to the break room. It was small and dimly lit, with a few chairs and a very old vending machine. "You'll be in charge of keeping the place quiet. Just sit at the desk until your shift is over," he told me, still not looking at me. I asked, "Is that all? No tasks or anything?" "Just stay," he replied, not meeting my eyes. The first few hours were uneventful. I sat at the desk in the back of the building, looking out at the empty parking lot. It was silent inside, not even a hum from the computers. The only noise was the occasional rattle of the vending machine, but that stopped after a while too. Around 9:30 p.m., I started feeling uneasy. The rules were making me nervous, especially the one about the basement. I didn't know what was down there, but I wasn't planning to find out. It was just a job. I needed to get through the night and collect my paycheck. At 10 p.m., things got weird. The building was completely still. No sounds, no movement. I tried to listen for anything, but all I could hear was my own breathing. Time seemed to drag on, and I felt isolated from the world. At 10:30 p.m., I heard a knock. I froze. It came from the hallway. I glanced at the door, but saw no one. I remembered the handbook's rule. If you hear knocking, do not answer the door. I didn't move. The silence felt heavy. The clock on the wall ticked slowly. Another knock came. My heart was racing. The knock sounded urgent, like someone trying to get in, but I remembered the rule. I had to stay put. I didn't know what was out there, but it wasn't my job to find out. I tried to stay calm. Another knock came, followed by the sound of footsteps. I didn't move a muscle. I just stared at the door, waiting for what would happen next. The footsteps stopped, and then nothing. I waited. It felt like hours, but the clock said only a minute or two had passed. I stood up slowly and opened the door a crack to look outside. There was no one there. The next night was worse. The knocking started earlier, right after I sat down. The break room door rattled as if someone was trying to force it open. But when I looked through the small window in the door, I saw nothing. No one in the hall. No footsteps. Nothing. I felt like I was losing my mind. It was just a job, I kept reminding myself. But the silence was oppressive, and the knocking felt like someone was trying to communicate without words. Maybe it was a prank. Or maybe the building was settling, creaking. But the air felt wrong. Every second felt like I was waiting for something big to happen. At exactly 10 p.m., the door rattled again. Then the knocking started. This time, I didn't hesitate. I got up, went to the hallway, and headed for the stairs. I had to know what was behind it. I wasn't going to leave, but I couldn't just sit there. I reached the stairwell. The light flickered as I descended. My footsteps echoed loudly. I turned the corner and saw the basement door slightly open. I had never seen the basement, but I couldn't stop myself. I pushed the door open. The air was thick with dust. A few light bulbs cast an eerie yellow glow. The walls were covered in symbols, scratched into the stone, as if someone had been marking the place for years. Then I saw something in the corner, hidden under a tarpaulin. I couldn't look away. My heart pounded as I approached it. When I pulled the tarp off, I gasped. There were dozens of old photographs pinned to the walls, pictures of people I didn't know. In the center was a picture of Mr. Reed. His eyes were wide open, his expression wild, like he was trying to scream but couldn't. Behind the photo was a hidden door. I heard a faint voice. It called my name. "Come here," it said. I stepped closer, my heart racing. The room seemed to close in around me. Something told me this wasn't just a prank. There was something deeply wrong here, something dark. Then the door slammed shut. I spent the rest of that night sitting at my desk, shaking and staring at the clock. When my shift ended, Mr. Reed just handed me my paycheck and patted me on the back. He didn't say anything about the basement or the knocking, and I didn't ask. I never went back. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Even after I left Laurel Corp, I had this feeling that something was very wrong. I tried to forget about it, telling myself it was just a strange job with weird rules. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that there was something more going on. I kept picturing the basement, the strange symbols, the photos on the wall, and Mr. Reed's wild eyes staring at me from the picture. I kept hearing the knocking and the voice, which had sounded so clear, like it was right behind me, whispering my name. The night after I quit, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the basement door and heard the voice calling to me. I got out of bed and paced around my apartment, thinking. I had to go back and find out what was really down there. The next morning, I found myself standing outside the building. In the daylight, it looked different. There were no shadows creeping along the walls and no eerie silence. It almost seemed like a normal office building, except for the strange smell, the same smell from the basement, like stale air and dust. I hesitated. I knew it was a bad idea, but I couldn't ignore my curiosity. I stepped inside. The receptionist at the front desk gave me a half-hearted smile, not recognizing me at first. "Can I help you?" she asked in a flat, disinterested voice. I used to work here," I said, not quite sure how to explain why I was back. "I just need to speak with Mr. Reed." She stared at me for a moment before nodding. "He's in the back," she said, pointing down the hallway. I walked toward the back, trying to seem casual, but every step felt like it was leading me deeper into something I couldn't escape. The building was quieter than I remembered, the air thick with a kind of stillness that made it feel like it was holding secrets. I found the door to Mr. Reed's office. It was slightly open, and I could see him inside, sitting at his desk and flipping through a stack of papers. I knocked lightly. Mr. Reed looked up, his expression unreadable. "You're back," he said, like it was the most normal thing in the world. "Yeah," I said, my voice cracking. "I need to ask about something, about the basement." His eyes flickered for a second, almost imperceptibly, but then he gave a tight smile. "The basement? There's nothing down there," he said in a flat voice. "You should forget about it." "I can't," I blurted out. "I need to know what's going on here." For a long moment, he didn't say anything. He just stared at me, like he was deciding how much to tell me. Finally, he stood up, the chair creaking beneath him. "You really want to know, don't you?" he asked in a low voice. He stepped toward the door, his eyes locking on mine. "All right, but you'll regret it." He didn't give me a chance to respond. He turned and walked down the hallway, past the receptionist, and toward the back stairs. I followed, my heart pounding, the air feeling heavier with each step. He led me to the basement door, the same one I had seen before, but now it didn't look so secretive. It was just a door, with peeling paint and a rusty doorknob. Mr. Reed opened it slowly, and the stale air hit me like a wall. The smell was overpowering, like something that had been sealed away for years. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice tight. I nodded, my stomach in knots. "I'm sure." Mr. Reed stepped inside, and I followed, my feet dragging as I went down the stairs into the basement. The light bulbs flickered, barely lighting the space. The air was thick with dust, and I could see the strange symbols on the walls, the same ones I had seen before. But now, there was something else, something newer and more recent. The photos were still there, pinned to the walls, but they had changed. The faces were different. There were pictures of people I didn't recognize, but they looked familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. I looked at Mr. Reed and whispered, "What is this place? What's going on?" He didn't answer at first. Instead, he walked to the far corner of the room, where a large metal door stood. This wasn't part of the basement I had seen before. It was hidden behind a stack of crates, almost like it was placed there on purpose. He reached for the handle, his hand trembling slightly, and opened the door. Beyond it was a narrow hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. The air smelled even worse, stale, like death and something metallic. "This is where it starts," Mr. Reed said, his voice barely audible. I didn't want to go in. I didn't want to step into whatever this place was, but I had come too far. My curiosity had led me here, and now I couldn't turn back. I stepped inside and the door slammed shut behind me. I turned to find Mr. Reed gone. The hallway stretched out in front of me, the walls covered in strange symbols. There were more photos of people, all looking directly at the camera. It felt like they were watching me. A door at the end of the hallway creaked open. I didn't know what I expected to find, but it wasn't this. The room beyond the door was filled with rows of chairs, each occupied by a person. No, not a person. They were something else. Their faces were blank, their eyes wide and unblinking, staring at nothing. They didn't move. And in the center of the room was a pedestal covered in strange markings, with a glowing stone resting on top. I didn't need to ask what it was. I knew this was the heart of whatever Laurel Corp was. The stone pulsed with a low hum, and for the first time I felt like I was being drawn into something much bigger than me. My body moved on its own, and before I could stop myself I was walking toward it. But then I heard the knocking. It wasn't from the door this time. It came from the people in the chairs. I realized too late that I wasn't supposed to be here. The knocking started softly at first, like faint tapping, the sound of knuckles on wood. It grew louder and faster. Then it wasn't just one knock. It was a chorus, a rhythmic banging from each person in the chairs, their hands raised, tapping on the armrests with unnatural precision. I froze. My body wouldn't move, not because of fear, but because I felt compelled to stay still, like I was caught in some strange magnetic field. My chest tightened, and my throat closed up. The knocking grew louder, a rhythmic, haunting chant in the dark. Then the people in the chairs all turned their heads at once. Their eyes didn't blink. Their faces were pale and lifeless, like wax figures. They weren't truly alive, but they weren't dead either. It was something in between. Their gaze felt like it was piercing into me, making my skin crawl and filling me with deep fear. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't move. I was stuck there, staring back at them, like they were expecting something from me. A figure came out of the shadows, walking slowly toward me. It was Mr. Reed. His face was pale, and he looked very tired, like he hadn't slept in a long time. His eyes were wide and bloodshot. He tried to smile, but it looked more like a grimace. "You're here now," he said in a rough, scratchy voice. "You've seen it. You've seen the truth." He walked closer, his shoes making scraping sounds on the floor. "But you don't know why you're here yet, do you?" I tried to speak, but my throat was dry. I managed to whisper, What is this? What's happening?" Mr. Reed laughed, but it was a hollow, empty sound that echoed in the room. "It's happening because you wanted to know. You wanted to see behind the curtain. And now, you're part of it. You're not just a bystander anymore." I tried to move backward, but my legs felt heavy, like they were made of lead. It was like I was sinking into the floor, being pulled into something I couldn't escape. "Those people," he said, his voice softer now, almost gentle. "They came here, just like you. They wanted to know. And now, they're waiting for you." "Waiting for me?" I said, shaking my head. "What do you mean?" Mr. Reed didn't answer. He reached for the pedestal, and the stone on top started to glow brighter, flickering like a heartbeat. "Take it," he said, his voice barely louder than a whisper. "Take the stone. It's the only way." I could feel its pulse, like it was calling to me, urging me to touch it. I tried to fight it, but my hand moved on its own, reaching for the stone. The moment my fingers touched it, everything went dark. I woke up suddenly, gasping for air. The cold, stale air of the basement was gone, replaced by the warm air of my apartment. I sat up, my heart pounding and my head spinning. I looked around, disoriented. Everything in my apartment was the same as I had left it. There were no strange symbols on the walls, no eerie photos. Had it all been a dream? I rubbed my eyes, trying to make sense of what had happened, but something didn't feel right. The air felt heavy, like there was something in the room with me that shouldn't be there. I stood up slowly and walked to the kitchen. I needed something to calm my nerves, maybe a drink. I could try to forget the whole strange experience, tell myself it was just a dream. But when I reached the counter, my heart stopped. There, sitting neatly on the counter, was the stone. It was glowing, and as I stared at it, I could hear knocking. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. Knuckles tapping, one after another, like a distant chorus of voices. I turned away, my breath quickening. This couldn't be real. I hadn't gone back to the building. I hadn't taken the stone. But somehow, it was there. I stepped back, my mind racing. The knocking got louder, almost deafening. I couldn't stand it anymore. I grabbed the stone, its surface cold against my fingers, and held it up. The knocking stopped. The room was silent. I dropped the stone and it landed with a soft thud on the floor. The moment it hit the ground, everything went black. I woke up again. But this time, I wasn't in my apartment. The air was different, thicker, colder. I was in a place that felt alien, like I had crossed into another dimension or somewhere much darker. The walls were made of rough stone, like a cave or an old underground building. There was no ceiling, just endless blackness above me. I could barely see shapes in the dim light, shadows that moved just out of the corner of my eye. The air smelled damp and metallic, like rust mixed with decay. I stood up slowly. My body ached as if I had been asleep for a long time, but my mind felt fuzzy. My thoughts were slipping away like sand through my fingers. Then I heard the knocking. It was the same rhythm as before, steady and deliberate. It seemed to come from all around me, echoing off the walls like it was part of the place itself. It was unsettling, like I was in a world where time and space didn't work right. I turned in circles trying to figure it out, but I couldn't escape the sound. It was in my head now. The knocking grew louder with each passing second, and then I saw them. The figures, the people from the basement. They were standing in a circle, their faces pale and blank, their eyes staring at me. They didn't move, they didn't blink. They stood like statues, waiting. My heart pounded. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The words were lost in the thick silence between the knocking. One of them stepped forward. It was Mr. Reed. His face looked even thinner than before, with his skin stretched tight over his bones and his eyes looking empty. He reached out his hand slowly, like he wanted to touch me. I stepped back. "No," I whispered, my voice shaking. "No, please, I don't." But he didn't stop. His hand moved closer to me, feeling cold as ice. He was now very close, just inches from my face. His breath was shallow and rough. "You took it," he said, his voice sounding strange and distant, like it was coming from far away. "You wanted to know. You wanted to see." I couldn't move. I couldn't look away from his eyes. His words hit me hard. Everything that had happened, the strange job, the rules, the basement, the stone, it was all part of this. Part of them, part of whatever this place was. "You've crossed the line," Mr. Reed continued. "You're here now, like all the others before you." His voice became softer. "But you're different. You're already part of it. This place, this thing." His words felt heavy, pressing down on me. I didn't know how, but I knew it was true. Something inside me had changed. There was no way out now. The circle of figures around me moved slightly, their heads tilting in unison, their eyes always on me. Then I saw it. The stone, glowing faintly at the center of the circle. It wasn't just an object anymore. It had become part of them, part of everything. The stone pulsed with the same rhythm as the knocking, like it was alive, beating like a heart. I felt like I had a choice now. It seemed like I did. But there wasn't a real choice. I could either accept what had happened to me, become part of whatever this was, or... The knocking grew louder, louder than I thought possible. It filled the room, echoing through the air, through my very bones. And then I understood. I was never meant to leave. This was where they brought those who wanted to know the truth, those who asked too many questions. This was the price. I reached for the stone, and when my fingers touched it, the room filled with light. I woke up again. This time, I was standing outside the building, under the harsh fluorescent lights of the parking lot. The air smelled of burnt rubber and car exhaust. My body felt heavy, like I hadn't moved in days. But when I looked at the clock on my phone, it showed that only a few hours had passed. I blinked, unsure if what I had experienced was real. Maybe it was just a waking nightmare. Maybe it was all a dream. But then I felt something in my pocket. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the stone. It was glowing, faintly, like a heartbeat. It pulsed against my fingers, sending a shiver down my spine. And then I heard it again, the knocking, faint but clear. I dropped the stone, and it hit the ground with a soft thud. For a moment, the knocking stopped. The world seemed to hold its breath. But I knew it wasn't over. It wouldn't stop. I had crossed the line, just like all the others before me. There's no going back now. Story 2. I was coming back from another job interview. It was the third one this month. I didn't get the job again. Life has been tough for an ex-soldier with the current economic downturn. The COVID pandemic also wiped out all my savings, so I was ready to take any job that would help me pay my bills. I hadn't eaten all day and saw a McDonald's. It was crowded, so I thought, I'll just get a takeout. There were a few cars in front of me. A guy on a motorcycle was honking a lot, telling the car in front to move. He was tall with long hair and looked very angry. His arms were covered in tattoos. He got off his bike and walked towards the car in front of him. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but it looked like they were arguing. I got out of my car and walked towards the biker. As I got closer, the biker hit the hood of the car and pointed his finger at the man inside, threatening him. The man in the car looked scared. He had a young boy with him. The woman working at the drive-thru asked the biker to calm down, but he didn't listen. She called the police, and this made the biker even angrier. He grabbed the phone from her and hit her in the face with it. She fell back and started bleeding from her nose. The biker then turned to the man in the car. He opened the car door and pulled the man out. He raised his hand to punch him. I grabbed his arm from behind and kicked him hard in the shins. He yelled in pain and let go of the man. He turned to look at me angrily. He was wearing a black jacket with the name Kenny on it. I said, "Listen, Kenny, I've had a really bad day. Stop this madness or I'll break your bones." He snarled and threw a punch at me with all his strength. I moved to the right and ducked just in time, so he missed. Then he pulled out a switchblade from his pocket and lunged at me with it. I stepped aside and punched him in the stomach. He went down on one knee. I grabbed his knife arm and told him to drop it. "Drop the knife, Kenny. This is your last warning," I said. He started to reach for something in his shoe. I realized he had another weapon hidden there. Before he could do anything, I twisted his arm and hit his elbow hard. It broke, and he fell to the ground screaming in pain. By this time, other people came to help. As the police took Kenny away, he kept staring at me with madness in his eyes. "I'm coming back for you. You'll regret this," he yelled. I didn't care and walked back to my car. The man who was threatened by Kenny came up to me and shook my hand. "Hi, I'm Rupert. This is my son Henry," he said. I waved at the boy and he waved back. "Thank you for what you did," Rupert said. "You helped me keep my dignity and saved face in front of my son. This means a lot to me as a dad." I nodded, not sure what to say. He then asked, "Is there anything I can do to repay you? Please feel free to ask, anything." I thought for a moment. He seemed wealthy. "If it's not too much, I'd appreciate a job if you have one. If not, no worries," I said. He smiled warmly and handed me a card. "Come to my office tomorrow, we can talk," he said. From that moment, I became the personal bodyguard and chaperone of his 8-year-old son, Henry. We quickly became friends. I took care of all his travel arrangements. We went to McDonald's every week for his favorite burger and fries. I later learned that his father was very wealthy and made most of his money during the dot-com bubble. I also became friends with the woman at the drive-thru who was attacked by Kenny. Her name was Stella, and soon we started dating. With a fulfilling job and a loving girlfriend, my life was finally back on track. I couldn't be happier. Then one day everything changed. Henry and I went to McDonald's as usual, but Stella wasn't at the counter. I asked the staff about her, and they said she hadn't come to work. I thought it was strange. She had stayed at my place, and I saw her leave for work in the morning. I tried calling her, but her phone was off. I dropped Henry at home and went to Stella's apartment. She had given me a spare key, so I opened the door. Everything was in its place. I tried calling her again, but her phone was still off. I decided to go back to my apartment to see if she might be there. When I got to my door, I saw the lock was broken. The door was slightly open. I took out my gun and slowly entered the apartment. I saw a life-size figure of Ronald McDonald the clown sitting on my sofa. The famous mascot was sitting back against the cushion with one arm resting on the backrest, just like how he sits on benches outside McDonald's outlets around the world. I was a bit shocked, but quickly turned on the lights to see better. As I got closer, my knees felt weak. It was Stella. She was dressed as the clown. There were marks around her neck. She had been strangled to death. I managed to call the police while still in shock. I noticed her right hand, which was resting on her thigh, was closed in a fist. When I opened her hand, I found a crumpled piece of paper inside. It read, "She was really begging me for mercy. Where was Soldier Boy when she needed him, huh? Boo-hoo! I'm loving it! I'm loving it!" Signed yours, Kenny. I felt a surge of anger, but also helplessness. If it wasn't for the surveillance cameras at the entrance of my home, I would have been in prison now. The police saw Kenny carrying Stella's body and breaking into my apartment. They issued a nationwide notice for Kenny, and he's been on the run since then. Even after 2 months following Stella's death, the police hadn't caught him. I told Henry's dad about the situation. He knew his life was also at risk, considering what happened to Stella. But we were most worried about Henry. We didn't want him to suffer. So I started training Henry to take his safety seriously. I created multiple safeguards to protect him while he was outside. I always made sure to personally drop him off and pick him up from school. My boss appreciated everything I did for his son. He knew I was deeply affected by Stella's death. He was a generous and compassionate man, and I liked working for him. He did notice that I wasn't my usual cheerful self anymore. One day, while I was waiting at the office, he tossed me the keys to his new car. "This should cheer you up. Take her for a spin," he said. "And pick Henry up from school," he added, as he left for a meeting. I went down to the parking lot, and there it was, waiting for me, the new Bugatti Chiron. I opened the door and sat in the driver's seat. The fresh smell of the leather upholstery lifted my spirits. The boss was right. I do feel better, I thought to myself. I drove around the block and stopped by McDonald's to get the usual order for Henry and me. I felt a bit sad not seeing Stella at the counter anymore. I picked up the order and headed to the school. As I drove past the restaurant, I saw an old Jeep parked by the side of the road. I didn't think much of it at the time. When I reached Henry's school, I parked a few feet away from the entrance. A couple of minutes later, I saw the same Jeep from McDonald's drive past me and park about 20 meters ahead. I wouldn't have noticed it if I hadn't seen it at the restaurant. The Jeep had 3 passengers. They looked like bikers with tattoos, beards, and long hair. Then I saw Kenny hiding behind a tree, but I spotted him. He was signaling the others to get ready. I saw his Harley parked nearby. They were planning some kind of ambush. The school bell rang, and children started coming out. I saw Henry in the courtyard slowly walking towards the gate. I immediately called him and told him to go to the principal's office and stay there. I made it clear he shouldn't leave until I said it was safe. He understood. Henry was safe as long as he stayed in the school. Next, I had to move to another location. The last thing I wanted was for a child to get hurt. I started the car and drove past the Jeep, taking the next turn. I kept driving. A few moments later, the Jeep caught up with me. The driver swerved violently, forcing me off the road. My car stopped. The guys got out of the Jeep, all armed. Kenny came on his motorcycle and stopped a few feet ahead of me. He took out a shotgun and aimed it at my chest. The shooting started before I could react. I ducked for cover, closing my eyes. In my heart, I thought my time was up. As seconds passed, despite the bullets, my body felt light. Am I in heaven already? I thought. I slowly opened my eyes and looked up. I realized I was in an armored, bulletproof car. The bikers were furious, doing everything to break through the armor. Kenny barked orders to keep shooting. He pointed at me and yelled, "I'm coming for you." I looked at the seat next to me and saw the takeout I had ordered. Just to annoy him, I took out my Big Mac and took a big bite. I sat there enjoying my burger while bullets flew. The shooting stopped. Kenny was livid seeing me enjoy myself. I looked him in the eye and sipped my favorite milkshake. Then I continued eating my burger. He looked frustrated as his plan failed. He frantically gestured to his gang to keep shooting. They started again. But it didn't last long. They ran out of ammo and fled as we heard sirens in the distance. The attack had taken a toll on the car, but it withstood all the damage. It was a lifesaver. I looked at Kenny again. Only one thought was running through my head now. My turn. I turned on the car and drove straight into Kenny. He hit the front of the car hard, but I kept driving forward. He was holding on for dear life, his hands desperately clutching the sides of the car. Next in line was his prized Harley-Davidson. I hit it at full speed and watched it break into pieces, parts scattering all over the road. Then I hit the brakes and Kenny flew 10 feet forward. After he hit the ground, he slowly got up, covered in blood and bruises. His face was swollen like an apple. He pleaded with me, his hands folded, asking for mercy. "This is for Stella, and she's loving it," I said out loud. I hit the accelerator again. Story 3. Another night spent at my computer, frantically working on designs and stories. People liked what I created, so I considered myself happy. It was easier when I built up momentum and ignored my intrusive thoughts. A familiar notification sound grabbed my attention and redirected it to my messages. I could afford to break my momentum to communicate with the outside world at least once a day. I switched windows to see a mention notification, and suddenly my heartbeat crawled into my throat and time seemed to stop. The messy desk, covered with soda cans, crumpled paper, and LED screens, vanished from my view. Instead, I was surrounded by a blinding and dreadful fog. It felt like I had released a smoke grenade. I gagged and sputtered as my vision failed. My mouth dried with a horrible odor, and my ears were assaulted with anxious screams and agonized wails. It felt like an eternity, gasping for air, each inhale depriving me of more oxygen. Then, as suddenly as it started, it ended, leaving me stranded in what I quickly judged to be hell. There was no sky when I looked up, no endless horizon. It looked like I was in the middle of a hurricane. The storm clouds swirled and billowed into each other. Unlike a normal storm, there was nothing behind the pulsing clouds, just more chaos. The frigid wind sent shivers down my back, pushing the black smoke at terrifying speeds. I couldn't ground myself mentally to calm my panic, because every sense betrayed me. The ground I stood on was made of cremated ash and glowing embers from charred books and broken bookshelves. The soft, unstable ground reached my knees, and I felt the burn of fiery pages wrapping around me, branding me with ink and charcoal runes. Behind me was a colorless black abyss that I called water, but I couldn't imagine what horrors lurked beneath the surface. I could feel from the pounding in the earth that something huge was aware of my presence. The inky depths seemed safer. The ash stirred with each rhythmic stomp, but there were no signs of which direction to fear most. The stomping grew faster, and I decided to let my mind plague me with the unknown rather than get answers and die. I grabbed everything I could on my way to the coast, slowing down only to pick up supplies. I sprinted to a broken, still burning shelf and built a raft, using fistfuls of burning and stained paper as glue to hold everything together. The burns were intense but didn't slow me down. I wrapped layers of thin pages around my arms as makeshift bandages to cauterize my wounds and prevent more splinters from piercing my hands as I broke apart a board to make an oar. I pushed my hastily made raft toward the dark, moving water. The raft, made of varnished wood and disintegrating paper, wobbled as I pushed it further. I had no choice but to thrust myself onto it when the water reached my neck. The black liquid clung to my skin like mascara running from tears, making me feel weighed down rather than wet. I thought it was more ink than water. I watched a small patch of land shrink into a tiny speck on the horizon. I had escaped, but had no idea what lay ahead. As I paddled, I noticed something strange. The water mimicked my breathing. My rowing started steady and focused, and the water swayed in a similar manner. Then, as my arms grew heavy and my panic rose, the waters became restless, sloshing and churning. More ominously, a deep, rhythmic pounding came from the depths below. I was too out of breath to match whatever beast was on the shore. This felt like it came from all sides and distances. My anxious thoughts ripped past me like vicious gales slicing through the swirling fog. The less control I had over my thoughts, the heavier the air became, and the wind sounded like desperate wails of trapped souls. The fierce wind carried whispers of doubt and self-sabotage, making each stroke of the oar harder. I couldn't tell if the whispers were born of my own terror, or if they were the trapped declarations of withered souls who had failed before me. My eyelids clung together as I paddled as hard as I could. My heart raced, supplying blood to my shivering, aching body as I continued the monotonous task of pushing through a limitless abyss, praying for an edge. I couldn't understand how I ended up here or why. As surreal as it was, it felt familiar, like this wretched place was just a thin veil away from the reality I knew. My mind and body agreed to keep moving toward an imaginary destination, almost instinctively or from a repressed memory. Despite the chaos around me, I saw brief glimmers of a faint emerald light cutting through the endless smoke. I could only catch glimpses when I opened my eyes after taking deep, shaky breaths. Feeling newly invigorated, I splashed helplessly in the direction of the light. The splashing stirred the stagnant water, drawing attention to my vulnerability. The ink began to hum. Thin spires rose slowly from the ink after the humming started. The water within the ring of spires rippled and bubbled as the spires continued to rise. I realized they weren't spires but teeth, and I needed to escape. I dove into the inky water and kicked behind my raft. A massive shift forced torrents of ink to launch me and my raft into the air. I heard a deafening roar but couldn't clear my face fast enough to see the creature. I hit the water with a force that pushed me deeper, and my raft landed on top of me. I fought to get back on the raft, still unsafe but relieved. The pillar of light shone in my vision as I lay on my back, lifeless. That had to be safety. The pillar crept closer as I struggled to move forward, my muscles falling apart. My biceps felt like frayed ropes, but I kept moving, now accompanied by wails of agony. The fog in my brain thickened, leaving me feeling hopeless and inferior, almost slowing my momentum. The louder I screamed, the more ferocious and insidious the echoes roared back, repeating my inner doubts for the vast ocean to hear. My will was being smothered into an inky abyss, but before I could give up, my raft crashed into shallow land. The beacon of light was just a sprint away. My bare feet recoiled sharply as they stepped on the jagged and splintered bones that made up the dry land, replacing the ash. Each step drove splinters into my already burned flesh as I forced myself up the shore and into a dense thicket of thorny brambles and insect-ridden logs. My toes curled into the sharp ground as I cringed at the thought of what might be lurking in the thicket. I knew the base of the pillar lay within. The sound of crunching and squishing beneath my bloodied feet was accompanied by the symphony of grunts, tears, and wet smacks from the splintered brambles stretching beyond my sight. Exhaustion crept through my open wounds and paralyzed my legs. My bloody chest heaved as I desperately tried to inhale through punctured lungs. The longer I stood still, the more the environment around me twisted, with signs and sounds of movement flooding the area, marking me as prey. The calcified pillars, the final remnants of victims in this abyss, would fall apart as mutated insects and other stinger and fang-wielding terrors closed in. The shadows swayed, confirming my suspicion that something was eyeing me as its next meal. Still, I remained motionless. A new threat scuttled toward me at eye level from a decayed branch. It was a deformed or mutated arachnid chimera, a mix of wasp, spider, and pure panic. It had tailless whip-scorpion jaws, wolf spider fangs, and a hornet stinger. Its pincers locked into my torn muscle fibers through my left bicep, sinking its fangs into my corroded arteries. The beast's tail tore into my wrist and lodged itself into one of my surface veins. I felt the horrific agony of the piercing, yet there was no temperature change that comes with venom, until something snapped. Each negative thought, each doubt, began to take physical weight, making it impossible to move forward. The parasite was accelerating my anxiety and breaking my resolve. The foreign substance being injected acted like blood while corroding my veins and body until I was nothing but bone. My gaunt hand clawed into my emaciated arm in a desperate attempt to free myself, forcing the spider to burrow deeper and leave a tunnel through my forearm, rushing toward my heart. I grabbed the spindly branch it perched on and punctured my armpit. The pain was excruciating, but the grotesque sounds of crunching and squishing were worse. The husk faded to dust by the time it hit the ground. The lethargy never subsided, and I was losing blood even faster. I regained control of my legs and forced myself onward. The idea of stopping and giving up, not having to endure the inevitable pain of seeing no solution, the burning intensity of pincers, fangs, stingers, and more doing things to my body and soul I never imagined, was the most tempting offer my mind could create. Succumbing to my fate felt slightly more comfortable than the unknown that came with moving forward. Shaking my head violently, I pushed on and suffered more, still running, enduring more agony, blood loss, and hope. I tilted my heavy head upward and wiped my sweaty, blood-soaked hair out of my eyes. The pillar of light and its base were just within my reach. Fragments on the ground sunk deeper into the soles of my feet, scraping bone. The pillar of green light, which had recently been a beacon of hope, became an ominous threat. I contemplated all the scenarios where my situation could get worse, and messing with an energy-emitting pillar seemed like a solid way to make that happen. My immediate familiar torture became slightly more comfortable than the unknown once again. I continued slowly, step by step, until a polished ivory tower stood up to my chest, with a glass-looking dome, guarding a concentrated area of the same angry fog above me. The black, inky clouds swirled furiously within the dome, beckoning me to interact with it. I stared, mesmerized, and noticed there wasn't a dome, just electricity firing wildly from the smoke, making it look that way. Impulsively, I sunk my hand into the foggy storm, and almost instantly the winds above me followed suit. My hand began to feel numb, the sensation crawling up to my elbow. I panicked and flung my arm. A rift appeared in the sky where my hand had cut. A second plunge, followed by stirring my hand in circles, caused an imposing oculus to rip open above me. The newly formed portal revealed a blurry sight that felt familiar. I rotated my hand in the fog, and the image sharpened. It was a view of the reality I inhabited before the fog and nightmare started. I recognized the familiar sights of my bedroom, faintly heard my computer hum and my cat purr. The last thing I could remember was accurately displayed: my monitors, the papers, and the cans. The harder I tried to understand, the worse my mind spiraled. I gazed at my own point of view, yet I was consciously trapped here. I could feel everything I suffered: the rowing, bacteria-filled splinters, nightmarish insects. No words could escape my torn throat, just primal shouting as my mind gave up. That portal was me, the real me. But I was still here. Something was in control, taking my place in life, building relationships I could never fulfill, writing stories I could never conceive for the public to demand better work when I couldn't aspire to the original. My life was being lived for me in bold ways I never imagined. I didn't know what was a more horrific fate: returning to the driver's seat and living as the destined disappointment to all around me, or staying shackled to this damnation and living what could be an enjoyable and satisfying life, knowing I would never be truly responsible for any achievement or meaningful progress. Can one truly be happy and fulfilled when separated from themselves? Would the brief splash of glory mixed with the bitter sewage of defeat from reality be a concoction you could survive? I pulled my hand away from the fog, and the circular rift in the sky was swallowed whole. In all the panic, I fell into a catatonic numbness, something that would have been a miracle not too long ago. Numb to the pain I suffered toward what I hoped was salvation, numb to the injuries and horrors I'd endured, and worst of all, numb to the enclosing darkness. I succumbed to crushing defeat as I tumbled to the ground. I shrunk inward, begging for change, anything to push me from this very spot. I closed my eyes tightly to fight back the muddy tears welling up, only for my eyes to open, and I was back in my computer chair without a second passing by, staring at the new message with the timestamp reading, "Just now." "Looks really solid. I'm excited to see what you come up with next." A message sent by a dear friend who had just seen the new design I was working on and published. A message of unwavering support and optimism left their heart and became a frightening promise I couldn't fulfill once read. I went back to my keyboard and sketchpad to continue my diligent work, trying hard to stay focused, desperate for momentum so I could move on and finish my work. When you put your creation out there, what's the worst outcome? Honest and blunt silence, or deafening and entitled applause? Story 4. Paul was a single father. Ever since his wife, Evelyn, passed away a year ago, the mood in their small apartment had become gloomy. He and his 6-year-old son, George, spoke less and less over time. Sometimes Paul would try to start a conversation, asking questions like, "Hey George, how was school?" or "How's your dinner?" But he usually got nothing more than a faint groan or an unintelligible mumble in response. Eventually Paul learned to accept the silence. Many nights would pass without George even looking up at his father. One rainy night, after Paul had tucked George into bed, kissed him, and told him everything would be all right, he decided to catch up on some overdue work. He was halfway through an email when he thought he heard something. He moved his headphones to listen more closely and realized it was his neighbor. Paul had complained several times to the landlord about these loud, annoying tenants. They often kept him awake all night, causing him to be late for work and get scolded by his boss the next morning. But nothing was ever done about the tenants. As Paul cursed to himself, hoping the noisy neighbors would shut up before he went to bed, he heard another sound. A song. It was softer and seemed to be coming from somewhere else. At first, it sounded like a soft background track entering his mind. The tune grew louder, and he realized it was "Singing in the Rain" from that old musical. The sound was distant and crackly, yet somehow he distinctly heard it over the neighbors' booming music. He tried to pinpoint where it was coming from before noticing the open window. The curtains swayed softly in the wind, beckoning him over. Curiosity got the better of him, and he walked toward the sound. Paul scanned the empty street, searching for the source of the eerie music. It took him a while for his eyes to adjust to the dark. He thought it was probably just some drunk homeless person with an old radio. Nevertheless, Paul stayed at the window, needing to know the source. Just as he was about to give up and turn around, a small figure dressed in a black trench coat and a vintage hat nimbly tap-danced around the corner of the apartment block. The figure spun in circles while twirling an umbrella to the tune. The music grew louder as the man elegantly danced along the side of the apartment block, seemingly unbothered by the rain. Despite a deep pit forming in Paul's stomach, he continued to watch the figure as he danced along the street, wrapped around the corner, and disappeared out of sight. Only after the man was gone did Paul notice a couple of strange things. The man danced incredibly well, tapping his feet and soles at incredible speed to the tune, flinging the umbrella and spinning elegantly. The dancing was far too good for a drunk person. Paul realized he had been frozen in place from the moment the man appeared, happily dancing around the corner until he disappeared again. His neighbor's loud bass had faded into the background, even though it was much louder and closer than whatever speaker or radio the man had. That was another thing. Paul couldn't see any device that could produce sound the way he had heard it. The song sounded crackled and strangely distorted, as if it were coming from an old radio. The man certainly wasn't singing. There were instruments playing. It was all very weird. Paul blamed his tiredness for the strangeness of the incident and went to bed shortly after, knowing he'd be yelled at by his boss the next morning for not completing his work. Paul slept restlessly that night. Surprisingly, the neighbor turned the music down. He had dreams of being frozen in place on the street as the man danced toward him at high speed, the tune accelerating along with his movement and growing more distorted. The man's face had a wide smile plastered across it. Rain pelted against Paul's back as he helplessly stood there, waiting for the man to reach him. Waking with a start, Paul checked the time, 4:34 a.m. He lay awake for the rest of the night. The next morning, life continued as usual. Paul and George silently ate breakfast. He dropped George off at school and then forced himself to face his horrible boss. One thing stood out that day. Paul saw a headline on his phone: "Child reported missing." The location of the report was in their apartment's area. The police had no leads and were pleading for anyone with potentially useful information to come forward. Halfway through reading the article, Paul's boss tapped him on the back and snarkily told him to get back to work. That evening, Paul decided to inform the police about the strange man he had seen. He recounted the experience to the officer on the phone, but emphasized that he was tired and his story might not be 100% accurate. The officer said it was likely unrelated, but they'd take his story into account anyway, as they had nothing else to go on. Weeks passed and not much seemed to happen. There was still no sign of the missing child. One detective let slip to the press that it was as if the little fella just up and disappeared. Paul became more protective of George, making sure the apartment was securely locked at night, along with all the windows. Another couple of weeks went by, and the fear of another abduction became little more than a lingering thought. Then it happened. Paul had just begun to let down his guard when one night he had a strange dream. It was hazy, but he remembered the distinct sound of the song. Singing in the rain, just singing in the rain, what a glorious feeling. I'm happy again. As he woke up, the song didn't fade away with the rest of the dream. It grew louder. Once he was fully awake, a feeling of dread set in. Somehow, he just knew something was wrong. The man had done something. A sudden urge to check on George came over him. The window in the small lounge was wide open. This was strange, as Paul had definitely closed and locked it the night before. Every step toward his son's room felt heavier than the last. He became lightheaded, but fainting wasn't an option. He needed to know his son was okay. To Paul's horror, George's door was eerily open. It knocked against the wall as the breeze from the window flowed in. It took all his effort to peer around the doorframe. Paul's heart stopped. His son was gone. The song continued to play in the background as Paul regained his composure and frantically searched the bedroom. The blanket was strewn to one side, the window was open wide, and the curtains swayed gently in the breeze. There was no sign of George. It's okay, Paul said to himself. Maybe he was just hot, opened all the windows, and went into the kitchen to get some water. It's fine, but the kitchen was empty, as was the rest of the apartment, and the hallway leading to the elevators. At this point, Paul called the police, barely able to keep it together. He told the dispatcher what had happened. Several grumpy tenants stood at their doors, wondering what the commotion was about, but right now Paul couldn't care less. 5 minutes later, an officer showed up at Paul's apartment door. The officer had to let himself in because Paul wouldn't answer the door. Paul was broken down on the bed, head in hands. Cursing to himself, the officer informed him that a search party had been formed and was actively looking for George. Somehow, this gave Paul little relief. Barely audibly, Paul asked the officer if he heard that awful song coming from the window. The officer gave him a blank, confused stare. Paul got up and ran to his neighbor's door and knocked frantically. As soon as a frowning middle-aged man opened the door, Paul blurted out, "Do you hear it? That horrible rain song?" "What song? Go back to bed, for heaven's sake. It's 2 a.m., the man said before turning and slamming the door shut. Shortly after, a detective showed up at the door and asked for permission to search the apartment for signs of a break-in or other clues. Paul agreed. As it turned out, the case was very similar to the one from a month and a half ago. George had simply vanished. There were no leads whatsoever. Days, weeks, and eventually months passed with no sign of George. The case grew cold, with nothing to go on. Communication from the detectives to Paul about their progress lessened. For Paul, days seemed to blur together. He was fired due to his lack of attendance at work and was forced to beg for money from his parents while applying for as many jobs as he could. Eventually, he was accepted at a fast food chain and took a job as a night janitor at a local mall. Working close to 60 hours a week, Paul began to question the value of his life. He fell into a deep pit of depression and grief, but couldn't afford therapy. He had to start renting a cheaper apartment, but he didn't see this as a bad thing. He was leaving behind the horrible memories attached to the old apartment. He was on the verge of another breakdown when something unexpected happened. It was George. Nearly a year had passed since his disappearance. It seemed like all hope was lost, and yet there he was. Some kind strangers found him wandering around a few streets over and called the police when they realized he was alone. The police took him to the station where he was identified as George Lynch, son of Paul Lynch. Paul was called to meet his son at the station, and both were questioned. It was strange. The only thing George would talk about was how lovely it was to sing and dance in the rain. It was the only response he gave. The detective would ask, "Hey buddy, how'd you end up on Albert Street?" And he would answer, "Isn't the rain just lovely? I love singing in the rain." After an hour or so of questions and a medical checkup, George was allowed home with Paul, under the condition that he saw a therapist twice a week. As it turned out, therapy did next to nothing for George. Some nights Paul would wake in a panic, hearing that tune he despised so much coming from the room next door. It was George, sitting on the edge of his bed, staring out his wide-open window at the rain, singing softly to himself. Singing in the rain, just singing in the rain. What a glorious feeling. I'm happy again. Paul would rush into his room, lock the window securely, close the curtain, and usher him back to bed. This happened countless nights. Times were similar to how they used to be in a way, driving George to school every morning, mostly in silence, eating meals mostly in silence, and overall a stale mood in the now smaller apartment. As little as George did talk, his only talking about loving the rain slowly drove Paul insane. One night, Paul couldn't bear it any longer. He woke up once again to the patter of rain, accompanied by the tune sung by George. Emotions took over, and Paul marched into George's room. "Please, for the love of God, shut up. I can't do this any longer. Stop singing that song." He was so overwhelmed that he slammed the window shut, drew the curtain, and punched the wall. "But Papa," came George's calm, sterile voice, "the rain is amazing. Don't you love singing in the rain?" "No, I don't. Go to sleep and stop singing," Paul yelled. Apparently one of the tenants had called the police about the commotion. Paul briefly woke up in the police car before blacking out again from pure exhaustion. He had worked a 10-hour shift managing the restaurant, followed by 3 hours of cleaning at the mall. When he finally woke up properly, he found himself in a small room with no windows. It didn't take him long to realize he was in a holding cell. 10 minutes later, a man dressed in a suit walked in and kindly greeted Paul. He informed Paul that George was currently at a medical center with a concussion. The man then proceeded to question Paul about the night's events. Before long, Paul was found guilty of child abuse. It was concluded that he was mentally unstable, and he was sent to a mental ward where he would stay until he was deemed healthy. Paul couldn't believe how quickly his life had turned upside down again. He no longer had custody of George, who had been sent to a foster home, and he was stuck in a facility for the mentally ill. The mental ward didn't seem to help him much. He often had breakdowns, claiming he could hear a horrible rain song coming from the window. 2 years passed, and Paul did not make much progress. The song still haunted him regularly. One time, He claimed to have seen the strange man tap dancing in the rain just outside his room window, with the song playing in that old, crackled and distorted radio tone. He received regular reports on George, who was still the same. George barely talked, and when he did, it was always about the rain. Around this time, Paul received a call from the police station. George was gone. Again. It was very similar to the last disappearance. No leads, no sign of forced entry. Just gone. After this, years went by, and George did not show up again. Eventually, Paul was released from the mental ward and moved back to England to live with his parents while he got back on his feet. For the first time in a very long time, Paul began to forget his past trauma. He was happy. Shortly after, he secured a job as an assistant manager at a restaurant and moved into a new apartment. A couple of months went by and Paul was doing better than ever. He had a new girlfriend, a stable job, and lived near his family. Life was great. One rainy night, Paul and his girlfriend Freya were sitting down to watch a movie when Paul heard it. It was faint and crackly like always, but very clear. The voice had changed. Even through the usual distortion, it sounded younger. What a glorious feeling. I'm happy again. I'm laughing at clouds so dark up above. Fear and flashbacks consumed Paul, and almost unwillingly, he gradually stood up and moved toward the open window, the curtains swaying gently in the wind. He cast his gaze down toward the street below. "Honey, everything okay?" came Freya's soft voice, but he didn't respond. Just then, a small figure far below tap-danced nimbly around the corner. It was a young man dressed in a black trench coat and vintage black hat. Paul watched as the figure danced across the sidewalk. Then, for a split second, the man looked directly up at Paul, straight into his eyes. As the man smiled crazily, Paul could have sworn the eyes locked on his were those of his son, George. That night, a young boy went missing. There was no trace, no leads for the police, just gone. Story 5. Since I was a child, I felt this hum. I felt it in my bones, muscles, and tissues. My teeth would rattle and my eyes would vibrate. It was never painful and rarely uncomfortable. I would just feel it. It came in waves when I was a teen, but from my early 20s onwards, it never went away. I stopped complaining about it at this point. No medical professional could diagnose it. No evidence of nerve damage could be found. Nothing showed anyone other than myself what I was going through. Eventually, they stopped listening and assumed I was making it up. They branded me a Munchausen's victim and sent me on my way. Both of my parents died when I was only 21. I was living at home at the time, which led me to become the primary suspect. However, it was eventually ruled a murder-suicide. My mother had stabbed my father to death before slitting her own throat. I inherited the house, of course. I was an only child, which is something I'm thankful for. I was always afraid of getting a sibling, just in case they'd have the hum as well, because that way I'd be less special. One of the last things my ex-girlfriend said to me was that I looked like a heroin addict. She wasn't wrong. Sometimes I don't feel like I need to eat, so I just don't. This goes on for days until I start to feel hungry. Same with drinking. I might swallow some tap water while cleaning my teeth, and that sees me through for a week. Other than cleaning my teeth, I don't care about so-called personal hygiene all that much. I don't shower, I don't use deodorant. I heard that most deodorants have dangerous levels of aluminum in them and can cause dementia. I locked the door to my parents' room long ago. I forget what I did with the key, but I assume I threw it away. I never wanted to go in there again. I couldn't understand why my mother would do such a thing. Maybe she had the hum. She never sympathized with me whenever I told her about it. So that's unlikely. They never fought, never even argued. They'd take turns watching the television programs each other would choose every night. They were such loving parents as far as I can remember. I get gaps in my memory from time to time, never for anything important, or at least I hope not. I suppose I wouldn't be able to tell. Usually, I suddenly forget where I'm going while I'm driving, and I end up just turning around and coming home. Does anyone else have what I have? My teeth were rattling more than they always do. Every day for the past few weeks I'd wake up in the morning, and they'd actually hurt. Arc like hell. I felt like my body betrayed me, as I never get ill. I've never been sick with a cold, never broken a bone, or sprained an ankle or wrist. I can't even remember getting a paper cut. I decided to remove my teeth soon after. I don't eat much anyway, and I assumed I could live on soup. I stood naked in front of my bathroom mirror, and one by one plucked them out. It took some pulling, but other than that, they came out fairly easily. I chuckled to myself, thinking of all the people who pay dentists ungodly amounts to do something they could do at home. I didn't know what to do with the teeth once they were out, so I just left them in my dog's food bowl. Oh yeah, I have a dog now. Sorry, I forgot to mention. I woke up one morning and he was downstairs wagging his tail. I filled his bowl with dog food and gave him a few pats. It occurred to me that I didn't own a dog, but I reasoned that I probably just forgot buying him. I had a bed for him, as well as food and a bowl with his name on it, so I couldn't see any reason not to keep him. His name is Auger, apparently. I can't tell what breed he is. I don't miss my teeth. I was right. I could just live on soup. I got a laugh out of smiling at people in public and making them grimace. I thought it was the funniest thing ever. They'd all look at me with the same smirk of disgust before hurrying off in the other direction. I bought an old camcorder and started filming the people I'd scare. At first, I'd just watch it back myself. Then, I decided to digitize the footage onto my personal computer. Soon after, I began uploading the footage to the internet. People found it as funny as I did. I'm sure at least one of you reading this saw an old video of mine. The people online encouraged me to do it more. So I did. I decided to get rid of my hair. Ripping out my hair was a lot harder than I thought. It was messy, and by the end of it, half of my scalp was gone too. It was worth it though, as people's reactions to seeing me became increasingly comical. Some even ran away. Mothers would shield their children, and overconfident fathers would try to intimidate me away from their families. I garnered quite the following. I decided to make my own YouTube channel. This was 2011, so a lot more could slide by. Almost 2,000 people subscribed. I couldn't let them down, so I kept making more content. It was around this time that I had a run-in with a man called Happy. He got my number somehow and kept angrily calling me at all hours. He'd even wake me up during the few hours of sleep I'd get a week. One day, he knocked on my front door. I armed myself with a kitchen knife and answered. He looked calm at first, explaining who he was and why I owed him money. I told him that I had never seen him before. He got angry at that point and barged inside. My YouTube channel was doing so well. I'd make new videos now where I'd strip naked to chase after people at night. These videos got the most views by far. People started calling me a pervert in the comments though. I tried to explain to them that I wasn't getting anything sexual out of it. It was just all for a laugh. Still, the comments kept coming. Some even threatened to get me banned from the site. I couldn't let that happen. I decided to get rid of my penis. I showed what I had done in the next video and people asked me if it hurt. I told them it didn't, and that I didn't really feel pain. I tried to explain the hum to the people in the comments. I realized then that I finally had people that listened to me. That's all I ever wanted, after all. I set up a camera in my living room, sat down on my couch and tried to get all my feelings out. I explained the hum as best I could, even cutting off my nose to show them how I really didn't feel a thing. I stopped the recording and uploaded it to my channel that afternoon. People started to recognize me now. I think I've become an urban legend in my community. How teenagers, instead of getting scared, laughed and took a selfie with me. That was refreshing. I went home that day to find that my YouTube channel had been taken down. I tried desperately to get some answers, but to no avail. I was angry for a while and fell into deep depression for a week or two. But then I realized that my fans could still see me, and they'd still get a laugh out of it. I realized I didn't even need a camera. I don't know how, but something told me I could just go on as normal. My house is far away from town, but too distant that I can't just walk in and out whenever I please. I've stopped wearing clothes at this point as I don't feel hot or cold. I don't feel much at all, just the hum. Annoyingly, people keep calling the police on me, so I've started to get crepuscular. Auger keeps biting me, but I don't mind. I can't go to the shops anymore, so I haven't been able to get him any dog food. Usually I just let him gnaw on me now whenever he's hungry. He's eaten away at most of the meat on my legs. He's such a good companion. They don't call them man's best friend for nothing. I caught myself in the mirror the other day. I noticed how weird I looked. My entire face was flat and featureless, apart from my ears, which stood out like a sore thumb. I took a small pair of scissors from the sink and began to cut them off. Once they were laying on my bathroom floor, I admired myself in the mirror again. Now that my ears were off, my puffy lips seemed to protrude unnaturally. I sighed at my imperfection and cut them off. Now that they were gone, I noticed for the first time how weird my eyelids were. I didn't need the scissors for those. I just grabbed them and pulled them out. I left the trimmings in Auger's bowl and laid down on the couch for a few days. Once I got up, I noticed that Auger was getting quite thin. I'm not a cruel guy or anything, so I knew what I had to do. As much as I love Auger, I couldn't look after him. That night, I took him for a walk onto the English moors. Once we were far enough away from the house, I let him go. He tried to follow me for a while, whining as he nuzzled up to me. It was heartbreaking. I told him to go and find a farmhouse to stay at, but I don't think he heard me over the wind and rain. I started to run then, and eventually he stopped following me. I made it back to my house before sunrise. I never saw Auger again. I hoped a farmer found him and gave him a better home and a better name. All I've been doing lately is thinking. For the past few years, I've sulked around the house trying to forget about Auger. All I've been eating in that time was myself. I found a comfortable numbness and clung to it. After a while of thinking, I decided that I need to get rid of my body. All I am is the hum, after all. The rest of me is an imposter. I was making my way to my bedroom to wrap things up when I saw it. The door to my parents' bedroom was open. I took a cautious step towards it, followed by a few more. There was an all-encompassing, beaming red glow coming from the room. I walked inside the room and was bathed in it. The dead body of Happy was on the floor where I'd left him a few weeks before. The skeletal remains of my parents lay embracing on the bed in the same position I had murdered them in. I coughed a bit and then left the room. I fell onto my bed with the knife I had taken from Happy. I started to cut and immediately felt a whole lot less guilty. I skinned myself first, not that I had much of the stuff left. The hum got stronger. I slit my bones open and let the marrow pour out. I left myself on a pile on my bedroom floor. Finally it came to my head. I took my eyes out and grabbed either side of my mouth. I tore in opposite direction and split my head in two. Finally there was nothing left of me. There was just the hum. I thought about the hum and how weird it was. It clearly wasn't in my body. I guessed it wasn't in my mind either, although I could still think regardless. Was it chemical, spiritual? Beats me. Does anyone else have what I have?